Wonderful to have so many of you here with us for another Action for Happiness event. Thank you so much for being here, wherever you are in the world right now. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined this evening, or whatever time of day it is with you, by Angela Duckworth. Angela, thank you for being here.
Hi, Mark. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Really excited about this. Been looking forward to this for a long time. Huge admirer of all your work and really excited about our conversation. So for anyone who's new to these Action for Happiness events, we'll have a conversation together, Angela and I, on this theme of character and happiness. And then there'll be a chance for you to ask Angela questions. So please do use the Q&A function and you can vote on each other's questions. So we'll have hopefully a very wide-ranging conversation. And of course, Angela brings a huge amount of expertise in the world of psychology. She's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, best-selling author of a fantastic book called Grit, which has had a huge impact all around the world. I love the subtitle of this book, Why Passion and Resilience Are the Secrets to Success. She's the founder and CEO of Character Lab, a wonderful nonprofit working to help young people thrive. I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that and talk about young people in this time together as well. So look forward to seeing you all engaging on the chat as always. Thank you already for welcoming each other from all around the world. Let's keep it kind and friendly as always, and let's obviously really engage with this great topic this evening. Andrew, I guess there's all kinds of ways we could dive into this, but on this broad topic of character and happiness, I'd love to hear why you think these topics matter, because of course you have been working in this area for so long. Why are you passionate about this work?
I guess the interest in character and happiness dates back to, the dawn of human civilization. I mean, when has it not been a preoccupation? But it also seems timely. So I think, just current events, politics, at least for myself, my own children being teenagers on the cusp of adulthood, I just feel like with everything that's going on in the world and in our homes, the idea that, and especially for me, the science of character and happiness are an especially current topic. When I look at my daughters, Amanda and Lucy, who are 19 and 18 respectively, and I ask as a mother, like if I could wave a magic wand and have you lead a life of character and happiness, I would. But I do not have a magic wand. Instead, we have, research findings and we have conversations like this. And anyway, I think it is, of perennial interest going all the way back to the beginning of any civilization and any theoretical tradition, but also, 2021, the pandemic, global political dynamics, et cetera, and the children we have in our lives, the time is also right now for this conversation.
Yeah, so true. Thank you. Well, why don't we begin with a little bit of exploration about the relationship between these two things? Because at a superficial, cynical level, you might look at character and think of hard work and effort and worthiness, and you might look at happiness through the sort of modern consumer lens of a slightly frivolous, cheapened, consumerist, pleasureful thing. Of course, we can debate whether those perceptions are valid or not. But how do character and happiness relate for you?
People ask questions like, "Oh, what is happiness really? What does character really mean?" I mean, these are words that human beings created. So let me just define how I use those words. It's not necessarily how other people use the words. I find the way that I think about it to be useful to me, and you'll tell me, Mark, if you find that useful. So first I'll just say, character is a word that I think is basically synonymous with what other people would say is social emotional learning. On Monday, I was on a call that was organized by an international group, including the OECD, which is a consortium of a subset of countries in the world, not all countries, and they prefer the term social emotional learning. But I think what we're talking about is, all the ways that you act, think, and feel that are good for others as well as yourself. Examples include gratitude, curiosity, kindness that you began our time together with, humility, especially intellectual humility, grit, self-control, optimism. So these are all ways of acting, thinking, and feeling that are good for others and good for ourselves. And I think if you mention the word character, you don't want to not mention development. So I think character development, the idea that these are malleable, the idea that none of us are really born with all of the character strengths that we would hope to, like you're not born automatically like grateful for the good things in your life. You're not born necessarily automatically gritty. You might be born with the potential for that or the inclination, but character is that. And we can talk more about that. I'm sure we will. Happiness, a definition I find useful, which is not, just a kind of carefree, glib, oh, I'm experiencing a lot of positive emotions. I think most people in psychology would say that happiness is multidimensional. And so it is a life well lived, but it includes both positive emotion, but also a sense of meaning and purpose, strong and reciprocal relations with other people. I think many people, including Marty Seligman, my PhD advisor, would say that accomplishment is actually part of happiness. So whatever definition you have for happiness, I think if you ponder the very idea of happiness for even a moment, you understand that it must be thriving in multiple dimensions. I'll end with my own definition here, which is that I absolutely agree with these other theorists that happiness is multiple dimensions. And I think that when we think about it, we should at least think about, social thriving, emotional thriving, physical thriving. And then the list probably goes on, but at least as a sort of short list, it has to be at least that.
That's lovely, really helpful, and actually incredibly in line with the sort of values that we try and bring to this whole Action for Happiness community. Because I think our desire in this community is to not just find ways to be happier, but to find ways to really help make a difference and to bring that to others. So this idea of these being cultivatable traits, if you like, or aspects of a person that you can develop, we seem to spend a lot of time in our lives developing certain aspects of ourselves, particularly our intellect in a educational school sense, becoming, developing our, ability to succeed in conventional terms, academically, work-wise. We also, to some extent, know how to develop ourselves physically in terms of our health and so on. It feels to me that both traditionally and to some extent still, we haven't really got that much of a culture around cultivating character, especially in a world that may be letting go of some of the traditional religious and spiritual practices. Do you agree? Do you feel there's a void in modern society about cultivating this?
Well, I do think that we need to do better. I think most parents probably, would say that they are, trying to help their children develop character and the dimensions that I mentioned. But I think that, and by the way, that's my husband walking. I'm sorry. I'm going to ask him to be quiet, Lovey. I'm on a webinar. He might wander in, but he'll be a blur. So I think that it's not that, we're in a crisis where nobody cares about character development. But as I mentioned, Mark, I think one of the exciting things is that when my parents raised me and when my grandparents raised my parents, there was very little scientific knowledge about what made somebody more honest than someone else in a particular context, what made someone kind, what are the roots of gratitude. And now on every single question you might ask, there is now some evidence. And for example, gratitude. Well, we know that you can actually encourage yourself and others to be grateful by ritualizing, the attention to 3 good things. I wake up every day, Mark, and before I get out of bed, including today, I think of three good things, and automatically, the color of my world changes. And oh yeah, I do remember that my daughter said thank you, like miracle, and then she smiled. So I do think that on all of these classic questions that parents have wrestled with for ages in terms of helping their children develop character, we now have scientific research, random assignment experiments, and so forth to more substantively say, oh, this is how to develop character and why.
And that's really encouraging. And I love how the daily practices that many of us have, and you've shared yours there, and I have some similar and other things as well, and how that sort of fits with what we're finding scientifically now, because I think it's that link between the evidence and the personal practice that helps make this really meaningful for people. I've seen when you talk about cultivating character strengths, Angela, that you talk about strengths of heart, strengths of will, and strengths of mind. I wondered if maybe you could lead us into a little bit about what are character strengths and maybe a bit more about those distinctions.
I have data from now, thousands of adolescents. And what strikes me is that there are really three families of character when I ask students or parents or teachers to answer questionnaires about, what their everyday behaviors and habits and tendencies are. So one family, and I say family because what I'm about to describe, these character strengths tend to go together. They tend to kind of, if you have one of them, it's more likely than not that you have the others. So these are all interpersonal strengths. So being kind, being generous, being grateful, having integrity, being honest. And when you think about people that who are really interpersonally wonderful, they do tend to, it's like, oh yeah, that really kind person, they tend to be a grateful person. Oh yeah, that's right. And they can tend to really have like integrity and not want to do things that are moral, etc. So those are strengths of heart, and they correlate very strongly, by the way, with your relationship quality. And if you ask me as a mother, I will tell you that I would put this family first. First let my children be kind and honest and giving and empathic. But I do want to mention the other two families because they are, as I mentioned, like good for yourself as well as for others. So mind, right? So these are the intellectual character strengths: curiosity, creativity, imagination, open-mindedness, intellectual humility. So these are the thinking strengths. And I hope my children, of course, develop these as well. These tend to be, correlated with things like, reading for pleasure. In some cases, they're correlated with academic achievement. I think it depends a lot on where you're going to school because it's not always rewarded being an intellectually curious, open-minded, hungry to learn child. But these, I think, stand on their own, even if they don't have, GPA or test scores as their outcome. And then finally, there's what I study personally as a scientist, the psychology of effort. And that includes grit and self-control, delay of gratification, optimism, I think arguably growth mindset, proactivity, initiative. And these are the kind of like getting things done strengths. And sometimes people call them achievement strengths or performance character. I think these are also important, but if I had to give a rank ordering, I probably would give them in the order I just gave you: heart, then mind, then will. One thing I also find in my data, though, Mark, is that even though you have these clusters, right? So these families where like, oh, if you have one, you likely have the other within that family. It's also in the data very clear that the families themselves are positively correlated. And why is that? Why is it that kids who tend to have interpersonal character also tend to be quite high in intellectual character, and also on average tend to be high in this kind of, achievement or intrapersonal character? I don't know, but one guess is that, I think the conditions under which people thrive, people of all ages, but I'm thinking especially of young people, are the conditions that make all of these character strengths develop. Having people who love you unconditionally, having wonderful role models in your life, having opportunities to be engaged and challenged. In so many contexts, you can think, oh yeah, that should help interpersonal character, but also intellectual character. And come to think of it, also, this intrapersonal or performance character: heart, mind, and will. So that's a bit of a lay of the land. And many other scientists have looked at character and asked, what are the natural families, what are the natural groupings? And I would argue that, to a large extent, the different scholars who work on this would have some agreement, and they might say like, oh, I could split this family into two, or, but I think there's a lot of consensus about these kind of natural divisions.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Now, before I dive further into this, because I find this whole area fascinating, I'd love to just bring it back to the community, to everyone who's with us this evening. Now, I know there are lots of great online tools where you can find out a bit more about your own character strengths and, in various different ways. And we can certainly share links to VIA and other things in follow-ups from this. But I wondered if you could pose a simple question that all of us could try and answer right here, right now, about, something along the lines of, what's one of your strengths, or something like that? Because it'd be lovely just to see some of the self-confessed strengths we have in the audience. Now, I know that as a Brit, many of us find it a little bit awkward to sort of, sort of what feels like showing off, to sort of say, oh, I'm actually quite kind sometimes. And, is there a way that you could encourage us to sort of lean into that and share something about one of our own character strengths here?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. And first, I'll say that if you go to characterlab.org, which is the nonprofit whose vest I'm wearing, and it is an important passion project for me. Each of the playbooks for each of the character strengths that we have on that website, which, by the way, our playbooks are written by the lead scientists themselves, so it's not translated. It's written by the person who actually studies kindness or studies gratitude, et cetera, et cetera. There's a pulse check. And, for the very reason that you say, Mark, I think it's enormously beneficial to some extent to hold up a mirror, as it were, and to ask yourself, like, how grateful am I really? What questions would I ask myself to know that? So I'll just say that for each of those playbooks, there's a set of questions that we designed actually to be useful, whether you're, 15 or 45 or 85. So they should be questions that you can ask around, for example, the dinner table, and then everybody reflect a bit. I will say that for any of these questions, let's take, grit as something that I study a lot. You might say like, oh, it feels a little silly to say like, I'm an especially determined person, that, setbacks don't disappoint me for very long. I bounce back from failure and adversity. That's certainly true for every single one of these desirable character strengths. But what's interesting is that when you ask people to reflect, I mean, they really, I think, can. I mean, I can certainly say, for example, that I struggle a little bit, frankly, with intellectual humility. I have such confidence sometimes that I'm right. And when I look at those questions and I think like, oh, have I really paused to consider in a non-defensive way that I could be wrong, and then I have to think like, maybe not. So I do think questionnaires in general, the VIA, the survey of character strengths, the things that you find on Character Lab, they've mostly been designed for research, as the VIA questionnaire was originally. I was actually in the next door room when Chris Peterson, I had the office next to Chris when he was doing the final touches on the VIA survey, designed for research, but absolutely wonderful as a kind of psychological mirror. And then when you like what you see, you can lean into it and make sure you're more intentional about it. And when you don't like what you see, you can maybe work on those strengths as well.
What I love, well, thank you for that answer. But what I love is already on the chat, we're seeing some people who are sharing some things. Mohammed said appreciation of beauty and excellence. Joanna said kindness and grit. Tony said intuition. Sue said tolerant and patient. Adisha said passion for learning. Peg said resilience and compassion. Debbie said humor and love. So again, if you haven't had a chance yet, folks, and you'd like to share what comes to mind for you about your own strengths, then please do. Love of learning and spirituality, adaptability, caring, curiosity, disciplined, creativity again.
Something that leaps to mind as you're reading that wonderful, rainbow of strengths, is when Chris Peterson was designing the VIA, I asked him, I was just a student at the time, and I said, when you calculate the scores, right, like, how often do you think like people are just totally astonished? And he said, well, sometimes you get some surprise in there, but when given a moment to reflect, many of us do know our strengths. We may not be as aware as we could be, especially in our day-to-day lives. But I think actually that's just wonderful to, to just pause and think about, like, when you really ask yourself, like, given this list, where do I really shine? I do think many of us have that sense, and it's not a complete mystery that you have to wait for a questionnaire to reveal. I think the questionnaire gives you a little bit more precision, and when you actually read the items in the questionnaire, I think that's where you say, like, oh yeah, that's a very interesting behavior. When that particular question is interesting. But yes, Chris would, I think, say that many people do have some intuitions about what their strengths are and their weaknesses.
Yeah, and it's lovely to see. Thank you to everyone who's been sharing them here. I find it really inspiring to see people sharing such, as you say, rainbow of different traits, but also, yeah, just this openness, and just see this sort of celebration of the good sides of human intent, if you like. I'd love to dive a little bit more into these different types of strengths you talked about, and maybe I'll take them in the order you did. Around strengths of heart, it feels to me that sometimes the strengths around kindness and compassion and so on are seen potentially as weaknesses, that if we are too open to tolerating other people's imperfections, or even sort of bad behaviors, and always trying to be kind, maybe that isn't, maybe we need to be tough, not kind sometimes, especially in a cruel world. So I love, within the Action for Happiness community, we have such a strong sense of compassion, and I feel it's sort of gritty compassion, not soft, or not just sort of ineffective, if you like. So I wondered if you could say a bit about how we can maybe combine some of those strengths of will around grit along with those strengths of heart, to sort of create a slightly more, I don't know, the kind of kindness that can change the world, rather than just sort of be swept aside in the face of adversity.
Now, Mark, it's a position that may or may not be widely held, but I'm going to tell you what I really think about whether you can, for example, have too much grit or too much kindness, too much honesty. It's a version of what you started this question with, and also I'm going to end with just violently agreeing with you about the combinations of strengths, and how that really is, I think, what we're all going to strive for, not to have just one strength, 10 out of 10, but to have a combination of strengths and across heart, mind, and will. And that is living life, I think, to its fullest. But let's begin with whether you can be too gritty, too kind, too honest, too humble, to anything that we've been talking about. Aristotle intimated as much. Aristotle had this idea of the golden mean, that somewhere between the two extremes of, say, cowardice and folly would be the exact right level of bravery. Maybe not exactly the midpoint, but somewhere between the extremes. And you could argue that for all of the character strengths, that, you don't want to be a 10 out of 10 on grit. Oh, goodness, you wouldn't want to be a 10 out of 10 on honesty. And you can imagine these scenarios where, like, oh, if you're too gritty, then you follow bad ideas to the end. And if you're too kind, maybe you're so selfless, you don't take care of yourself. And maybe you could be too honest, because, when somebody's wearing a really ugly dress, like, maybe it's not the time to tell them, exactly what you think. Now, that all makes sense, but here's where I would like to disagree politely with Aristotle, which is, I don't know that it's a problem to be 10 out of 10 on kindness or honesty or grit or anything else. But I do think that if you're a 10 out of 10 on kindness and you're lacking in something else, like proactivity, or just a sense of being able to care for yourself, or judgment, right? If you're 10 out of 10 on grit but you lack wisdom, like, it's not a problem to me to be 10 out of 10 on these virtues, which, by the way, I haven't met many people who really are, so far at the extreme that, like, it's becoming a handicap for them. I think it's more that we want to think about character development holistically. And I think a healthy person who does good for themselves and does good for others has a collection of signature strengths that are in balance. And, they are not caricatures, not in the sense that they're not 10 out of 10 on things, but just that they're not lacking in some deficit that really makes the combination horrible. I mean, thinking about certain political leaders, I can think of people who are especially gritty and especially lacking in empathy. I mean, that's catastrophic. But it's not a problem about being 10 out of 10 on grit. It's just being 0 out of 10 on empathy. So I think of this as, in a way, my job as a parent is to raise 2 daughters with my husband who have some strengths in heart, some strengths in mind, some strengths in will. And just if they're able to do that, then I think there's, reasonably good chance that they're not going to have, bad effects on others and so forth. So that's a slight difference of opinion, I think, between my own view and the classic Aristotelian view. But I have long wanted to say that out loud because, again, like, I don't want to tell my kids, like, oh, aim for a 7 on kindness, aim for a 7 on honesty, and maybe, a 7 on bravery. And it's like, no, aim for a 10 on everything, but don't forget that, it all matters.
How wonderful. I love the ability to politely disagree with Aristotle. I think that's fantastic.
Not here to defend himself, of course, but anyway.
I wanted to sort of move to looking at young people and children and sort of how we develop or fail to develop some of these things in early life, and then we can come back to sort of later in life and maybe some of the things we might have missed out on in that journey. But rather than talking specifically about the wonderful work you do in Character Lab, or indeed young people in general, I actually like to make it personal, because I think it always brings this to life. You've talked a few times about raising your own children. How do, when I'm a parent of slightly younger children than yours, but this is certainly on my mind as well, how can you, as a parent, or indeed anyone who cares about a young person, cultivate these strengths of mind and heart and will? What are some of the practical ways that you do that on a daily basis?
Well, one thing I will say, and it goes in the theme of, like, oh, you can't, there are some things that you can't have too much of. And I would argue that virtue and character are one, as in the way that I just described. The other thing I want to say about parenting and children, you cannot love your children too much. Like, you cannot be too adoring of these young people in your life. And I think that view has taken different turns over history. There definitely was a parenting view that you don't want to spoil your children with love. You don't want them to think that they're the center of the universe, because then they'll end up being narcissists or coddled or soft. And I completely disagree with that. I think if your kids wake up and they think, like, I am adored, I am wonderful, there is an unconditionality to the affection that somebody very important has for me uniquely. I think that is a recipe for healthy development in all of the dimensions that we describe. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a perfect parent, by no means, and neither would either of my daughters, but I think they do know they are loved, and there was no limit, and there's nothing we wouldn't do. So that's unconditional, warmth, affection, like, everything is for you. I think it's second point to make, that children need challenge. I think when we worry about spoiling our children, or them being coddled, or sort of not growing up, I think that may be because the natural human reaction when you care about someone is to take away pain, and sometimes that can take the form inadvertently of taking away challenge. When my kids were, as soon as it was legal, I made sure that they got jobs, that they needed somebody to answer to who was not mom or dad, who would be annoyed if they were late, who would be annoyed if they, didn't follow the rules that they were supposed to follow. So they were challenged. I remember, during summers, that sometimes my daughters wouldn't want to, like, go off to that first day of camp or some sport, etc. And we nudged them a little bit out of the nest to be challenged to do things that they couldn't yet do. So unconditional love, but I think kids do need to be challenged, because I think left completely without parents to push them to do things that they can't yet do, or they're a little bit afraid to do, or they're a bit uncertain, that they won't grow that way. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think when we talk about role modeling, which I'm sure you've talked about at Action for Happiness, how so important it is to, if you want a kind child, well, they're watching you all the time. They watch how you answer the phone. They watch how you, order your food in a restaurant. I will say this, I am not a perfect role model. But one thing I am is an intentional role model. And I listen. As my children got older, they would say to me, Mom, at Character Lab, you talk about kindness, but the way you just talked to that person on the phone at reception when you were annoyed that they didn't bring such and such, was really unkind. And then I had to really pause And first I was defensive, but then it passed. I was like, you're right. I was not speaking to that person in a kind way. So I think as you model for your children, model intentionally. And then you don't have to model perfection, but I think if you just model that you're trying and that you're also like them developing, these are very powerful. And that unconditional love, appropriate challenge, and then intentional role modeling, I think that's mostly the recipe for parenting and leadership too.
Really wise. And I wonder, I agree with all of that. I've always felt that sort of unconditional love together with boundaries and sort of some kind of something to aim for was the right blend. But I've sometimes, I mean, this is there was you challenging Aristotle. I've sometimes found myself questioning something that I've heard the Dalai Lama and others say about when children are born, they come into the world innately kind. We have, we have a sort of natural altruism as well as a sort of self-preservation instinct. And I have seen that in the children in my life, but I've also seen, lots of unkindness, innate sort of selfishness in my children. And I've often thought, gosh, is that my fault? How have I managed to create children that would be so rude to their sibling or their parent or something? But of course, it feels to me that repetition is important here, which is we build any habit, whether that's our sporting habit or our maths or anything we're doing, you just keep practicing it. And I think actually an environment that encourages you to keep just taking a breath and trying to be kind. And like you just gave in that beautiful example, like we make mistakes and it's okay, but if you notice, you can then change how you do it next time. So I feel that there's something here about like actually we are all flawed and it's about keep going and keep practicing. And it's just almost like it's a journey of a lifetime, really, isn't it?
There are these philosophical and religious traditions that say, oh, there's original sin, or like, we're deeply flawed, and you spend your whole life trying to like, wash away the sin. Then there are other religious and philosophical traditions that say, no, we're fundamentally born good. There's like innate goodness. So like we're really inside, we're angels. And so like that's the thing. And then so that's the opposite, right? And then there's, traditions that say like, well, we're born tabula rasa, like there's nothing. I think the modern neuroscience would say that there certainly are tendencies and potentialities that we are born with. For example, the fact that many people are kind, that movies that we all like have heroes that do kind and valiant acts. That certainly speaks to some wiring, as it were. But I think what the neuroscientists would say is that these are all experience dependent and experience expectant. And it's a little jargony, but it's just to say that even if we have some innate tendencies towards goodness, that they need experience to be developed. And that is why parenting and culture and conversations like this and action for happiness are so important, because you can't really just say, oh, well, as long as we don't like get in the way, this person is going to grow up automatically an honest, kind, hardworking, curious, creative human being. It's like, no, that's not how human nature works. Whatever these tendencies are at birth, we absolutely need other people and a lot of repetition and a lot of examples and a lot of practice to continue to develop them.
So for all of those children that are lucky enough to grow up in a house where the parents do give them unconditional love, or those of us who've had, relatively stable, secure backgrounds where those things have been cultivated, that gives a huge help in how our life paths go. But for many people, they may not have had that. They may have grown up in a slightly more fragmented, unharmonious, household
And the
environment, or
extremes, right? I mean,
just not feeling
and
loved,
horrible
not
extremes.
not having their kindness cultivated, not experiencing kindness. How possible is it for someone in quite a difficult sort of both character and sort of psychological experiential position to then be able to cultivate things that weren't part of their sort of foundation years?
Well, having established quite without equivocation that more love is better and more stability and security is better, and that adversity is bad. I mean, if you ask me as a psychologist, like, oh, what's the effect on the brain and the mind and human development and capacities and cognitive ability and, social relationships, et cetera, of trauma and adversity, it is bad. So I want to make sure that's clear. But then let's talk about resilience and about what is possible, even in extremely difficult circumstances. So Cody Coleman, I wrote about in my book, but I want to say, you know, I've stayed friends with Cody Coleman. He reached out to me when he was still at MIT as an undergraduate, which is where he graduated with his undergraduate degrees in computer science. And actually, he got a master's in electrical engineering with a 5.0 in engineering and a 4.9 in computer science. He reached out to me because he said, Dr. Duckworth, I'm from nothing. I mean, I have every risk factor. I should be in jail right now or dead. He's just graduated from Stanford as the first Black PhD in computer science in 20 years. And if you ask Cody this exact question, what is possible for a human being who does not come from a stable parenting relationship, who does not come from having enough food to eat sometimes, et cetera, I think he will tell you that he's going to spend his whole life working to make sure that children have more of what he didn't have, and that it is possible. And somehow Cody was able to, I think, remain an optimist. I mean, when I asked him, like, you tell me, my first conversation, I said, like, I want to know from you. I have nothing to tell you. You tell me how you ended up where you did and on this trajectory. And he said, well, I don't really know. But the first thing he said, he's like, he paused and he said, I am an optimist. He said, I smile a lot and I'm always trying to look for what I can learn and what I can do. So I just want to say that there are examples of resilience. We want for all children what your children and my children have. But I also don't want to ever write off anyone because of their life circumstances. It is possible to begin to build that. And, he, through all of the ways that Cody was able to leverage and build and so forth, has now a very strong network of caring people, including me, who are, just super fans and would, drop anything, if he ever needed us.
While we're on this subject of, and I love Cody's story, on this subject of kind of resilience and coping in more difficult situations, I always love, being Action for Happiness, for us to bring out some really practical things that people in the community can respond to. Are there any favorite sort of resilience actions and ways of sort of responding to adversity that you find are really helpful that you could share with our community tonight?
Well, I'm thinking about Cody a lot, especially because I'm in San Francisco, as you know, Mark, and I'm going to see him for coffee. And I think when I email Cody, it's so great. At the very bottom of his email, he always signs off, "Make it a good day." And that has been his sign up for a very long time. And I think he always is looking for something where, even if it's like the worst and terriblest day ever, that one good thing that he could do to make it a good day, and he'll say, like, you can smile at someone, like that can make, I mean, you have control over whether you smile at someone. I use that example of being a little bit unkind when, like, a telemarketer calls, or if I have to call and I'm complaining to customer service about something, I can, in that 3-minute interaction, make that person's day. I can say, hey, by the way, before you go, I just want to say thank you. Like, thank you for changing my airline reservation. You have made a huge difference in, my upcoming trip. Like, thank you. I think that when we do these little things, it doesn't change the coronavirus. It doesn't change global politics. It doesn't change the outcome of the next election. But you, in a very small and meaningful way, I think you make it a good day. And I have always admired that about Cody. And I think that may have been one of the ways, even as a young boy who had so little that he could control, that he could always find something before he went to bed to make it a good day, especially for somebody who's not him.
That's a lovely example. I'm reminded of something that's become quite playful and helpful to me, which I have mentioned to this audience once before. But when I first worked with Krista Neff on self-compassion, and she helped me realize that I had quite a lot of really nasty things I used to say to myself. I'd be kind to others, but I'd call myself an effing idiot. And I found that this F word was something I used at myself much more than I thought I did. So I reshaped it to be my little mantra for how I want to respond in difficult times. FUCK, standing for friendly, useful, calm, and kind. So now when I have this kind of inner aberration, I remind myself that how I'd like to be in the world is friendly, useful, calm, and kind. And that both brings a smile to my face and actually shifts how I respond. So I find that helpful.
Brilliant.
So we've talked about young people. We've talked about sort of how to maybe deal with some of those challenges if you haven't necessarily had the chance to develop that character from an early age. I think in all cases, whatever age, this does to some extent require willpower. I know you've talked about strengths of will, but what we've discovered with Action for Happiness is you can know all the theory you like about the things that can make for a good life and can help others, but unless you put it into practice and find a way of habitualizing it, making it something that stays in your life, it's all well and good, but it drifts away. So how can we build strengths of willpower, ways of actually sticking to our virtuous ideas and making them reality?
So I'll just give you one suggestion. So I've studied willpower actually from the very first day of graduate school. And one of the things that you should know is that, yes, it takes some effort, right? I mean, you have to put some energy into making your life the way you want it to be. And that is absolutely true. But the question is how to make it the most efficient use of that energy possible. And I think one thing that every behavioral scientist that I know would agree upon is that one way to do this efficiently so that you're not exhausted, so you don't lose some motivation in the middle or, get burnt out, is to actually change your environment or your situation. Okay, so let's just take a trivial example. So say, for example, you really wish you were a little more grateful than you are. Well, you could do something to change your physical environment, like literally put a stack. This my husband does. He has a stack of thank you notes on his desk, right, with stamps next to them, right? Just so when he has that thought, like, oh, I should probably send a quick handwritten note to this person. He doesn't have to rummage through and then, oh, okay, I'll do it later. And so that's gratitude. Well, what about let's take self-control for exercise, right? Something that a lot of us have struggled with during the pandemic. I noticed that like when I had my clothes out from the night before, I'll wear this shirt, I'll wear this pair of leggings, and I'll put my sneakers over here. And these are the socks. Just that little bit of friction, a little bit of friction that I took away because the night before I laid it out and I woke up, they were right there. That absolutely made a difference in how likely it was that I was actually going to go outside and exercise. So these are physical changes. Of course, what you're really trying to change is your mind and yourself and your attitude and your psychology, but outsourcing that, as it were, a little bit to make your physical space that way. Like quite literally, I'm thinking about like Wendy Wood, I yell at Fishbach. I mean, like the world experts in habit and motivation, like their number one recommendation is to physically hack your space in ways that then help you kickstart the habit and repeat and repeat and repeat. And finally, I'll just mention that, people like Cody, and I'm thinking about another student, they would literally write post-it notes of the sort of self-talk they wanted to do or the kinds of thing, and there was like just stick in places, like, and I think again that's a way of outsourcing it. So you're taking that mental thing that you have to do that of course requires some effort, some agency, some energy, some initiative, but now you're like helping your environment help you.
Really nice. Thank you. That's a really nice practical example and very helpful. I want to move on to some of these great questions that have been coming in from the audience. So Eugenio asked, what's the line that divides grit from stubbornness? When does someone have to recognize that it's not useful to continue trying and actually, being fooled by what he called the sunk cost fallacy, the idea that I must keep going because I started, and being able to recognize that sometimes you need to let it go? And how do you see that?
The most practical thing I can say about, when to quit and when to grit, I guess, is to ask yourself why. When you ask yourself why, like, for example, like, why am I doing this call with Mark for Action for Happiness? I mean, for me, the why is that, like, it's part of, helping people learn about psychological science to help kids in particular, but everyone thrive. So, like, to me, it's a very clear why. And then if you then ask your question, like, well, should I quit this thing or should I not quit thing? Well, what's the why, right? Very often when you ask that question, you will realize that there are, especially say you're doing something that's frustrating, right? Like you're trying to get into veterinary school and like you just keep getting rejected. And I actually spoke to someone in particular who had been applying to veterinary school for 7 or 8 years. It may have been even more, I think. And they asked me, should I keep being gritty? Like, should I? And I asked them why. Like, why do you want to go to veterinary school? And they said, well, I just really love animals. I mean, I always have since I was, a little girl, and I want to take care of them. And then I asked them, is there another way that you could also get to that why? Like, is there another route? um, and I think that helps you understand that sometimes it is useful to quit one frustrating path, because there's an easier, better path to get to the same why. But when you really talk about these higher order goals, the higher you get, well, why do you care about that? What then you really get to your values, and those are things I think you can be as gritty as you want about. Never give up on your values, but maybe have some flexibility, some adaptability about how you're going to achieve those things that you care about.
Thank you. Really helpful. Our most upvoted question so far this evening is actually to do with people with ADHD, so that's sort of attention deficit disorder. And the question is, how can you grow a sort of character for those people with that condition, but indeed others, where they might have challenges to their motivation, self-discipline, their ability to have delayed gratification, and so on. Presumably, there are some people for whom development of character might be harder than others. Any advice on that?
One thing to know about ADHD is that it's often people say like, oh, I have ADHD, or oh, good, my daughter doesn't have ADHD. Like, turns out that makes it sound like black or white, either or. And it's not at all like that. The science of self-control suggests that, first of all, everyone struggles with impulse control, and some do struggle more than others, exactly as you say, Mark. And then beyond some threshold, people say like, oh, ADHD. But I think labels can be very dangerous, and I hope children who do have that diagnosis, are help to understand that, like, honestly, it's a continuum, and everybody does struggle, but some do struggle a little more than others, and therefore now we're going to call this ADHD. So that's one point I just want to make. My own husband, by the way, if my mother-in-law is to be believed, then my own husband actually had at one point in his childhood a diagnosis of ADHD. So let me give you some advice from how I've seen my husband do quite well, actually, despite maybe not having the world's greatest executive function, or just kind of the ability to inhibit responses in the moment, the sorts of things that people with ADHD really do struggle with. The point that we made earlier, Mark, about change your environment in order to change yourself. My husband learned quite early on that he could not pay attention unless there was nothing going on except for what he needed to do. So he, for example, in college, studied in the deepest, darkest part of the library, and he found some section that nobody ever went to, and he found a little carrel there, and he would study there, and there was nothing to distract him. Even today, if we're in the same place and there's a television on, or if there's something like music playing, it's like he can't really control his attention the way I can. I mean, I can just ignore the television and keep doing whatever I'm doing, but he can't. But he just figures out another way, which is, in his case, changing his situation. So I absolutely think that to tell our children, look, first of all, we all struggle with something. And, when it gets to a certain point, maybe you'll get a label or not, but no matter where you are on that continuum, there are always ways that you can find to be happy and to be successful, as my husband learned to be. It's only the limit is your creativity about how to make things work for you.
I love that. It's a really helpful and optimistic answer. And I'd also just like to acknowledge everyone in the chat who's been noting the challenge about labels in general, which is labels can be quite disabling and
Not a
inappropriate.
big fan of
So
labels.
thank you to everyone who's made that point so nicely in the chat. Now, it's quite, well, I would say easy. It can be potentially easy for us to develop the values we want to see in our family life, in our friendships, in our personal lives. But actually, one place it can be really challenging is in our workplaces, in a culture that can often be the antithesis of perhaps how we'd like to see the world show up. And Andrea has asked, again, a really popular question here, saying that character is one of the core values in her organization. But as a member of HR, they struggle to find ways to help employees develop character. So short of saying to someone, just have more integrity, be more honest, are there any actual recommendations for how we can really encourage genuine, authentic values in organizations?
Yeah, Andrea's question is a fantastic one. Here are two very I think specific suggestions, one is, I find increasingly when I talk to organizations, corporations, and so forth, there are book clubs. What a wonderful thing, by the way, right? So, if you feel like, your organization could do with a little more, bravery, or a little more generosity, or, really like literally anything in this canon that I think Action for Happiness would care about. Like, there are wonderful books, and I've seen, leaders say, hey, let's all read this together. And I think, then you're having conversations like the one we're having, Mark, and people don't feel like, they're being told that they're not kind or they're not grateful enough, but like, hey, let's just read this wonderful book. And that is one specific suggestion. Start a book club, and it could be a podcast club, or it could be, well, let's just all watch this one 45-minute documentary. It doesn't have to be a book, but I think that shared intellectual experience and the conversations that grow out of it is a great idea. And the second suggestion is appreciative inquiry. Many people in Action for Happiness might be familiar with this, but this is when an organization says, hey, let's do a kind of audit on a certain, thing that we care about. Like, maybe it's, being proactive, maybe it's having a growth mindset, or maybe it's, grit. But in appreciative inquiry, rather than looking at all the weaknesses and flaws and the mistakes and like, oh, here are the crises, actually, you just go out of your way to highlight successes. Like, what went really well this quarter? Like, when did we really show camaraderie for each other? What was our high watermark for trust? And like, oh, and then you tell stories. And I think what that does is it provides information. It provides motivation, and information and motivation go together in that circumstance. The problem with just looking at the flaws and the weaknesses, and that people get defensive, and it can be actually information without motivation. So I think appreciative inquiry is a wonderful example of a kind of asset-oriented approach that doesn't say like, la, 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 we don't have to do anything, because out of appreciative inquiry usually comes a commitment to do more, but it does it by looking at what's going right, not what's going wrong.
I love that. I love appreciative inquiry. In fact, I was having a conversation about it with my colleague Tracy just today, and was remembering how powerful that can be. I sense, though, that you and I are both sort of naturally optimistic people that might want to look for the good in the world, and that's wonderful. But Clifford's asked a question which I think is really important for us to all think about, which is, how do we avoid falling into toxic positivity? And I guess what he means by that is the ability, this sort of culture where you sort of almost have to pretend things are fine. I mean, in Britain, there's a lot of kind of like, yeah, I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. And we fail to tap into that vulnerability, that sincerity, that willingness to take off the mask and share that actually life isn't all roses right now, especially right now, actually. So how do we avoid that trap?
My colleague and my friend Mark Brackett, who is at Yale and who leads the Center for Emotional Intelligence, he has a way of greeting you that is just a little different than most people. So, hi, Mark. Hi, Angela. And then he says, Angela, how are you feeling? He doesn't say, how are you? He says, how are you feeling? And he says it. And then when he like really looks at you, he's like, Angela, how are you feeling? And it allows me to not just say, oh, I'm fine, how are you? This kind of reflexive throwaway and sometimes inaccurate way of describing things. And then sometimes he'll say, I'm feeling myself quite exhausted. And then he'll say, how are you feeling? And I think it just gives us, as he would say, permission to feel. And it's a wonderful little turn of phrase. I have tried to do it myself, and it actually works pretty well. However you do it, I do think that what people are increasingly, and I spent a couple of years in the United Kingdom, so I think I know what you mean. And I'm Chinese by heritage, ethnically, and I think there are many cultures where like saying that you don't feel good or saying that you're feeling quite discouraged actually is not, it's not done, right? But I think across the world that's changing. It may be changing faster in some places or than others, but I think it's a wonderful thing that we become more honest and more vulnerable, and that we are able to share with each other, our triumphs, but also our real challenges. I see that happening, at least in my, social network, and these little tricks, how are you feeling, or modeling that vulnerability a little bit first. I think that can help a lot.
I really love that. And it actually reminds me of a change we made within the Action for Happiness team. So we were trying to practice the great positive psychology ideas that you and many others have been championing for us for many years. And so we begin our team meetings with a moment of mindfulness and then a gratitude of like everyone going around and sharing one thing that's good for them. But it felt a little bit like it didn't get deep enough. So we introduced a middle component to that, which is just so before, after a moment of sort of pause, before sharing something you're grateful for, sharing just what's going on for you right now. And so that becomes this sort of process of breathe, like, actually, I'm really under pressure today, but I am grateful for the fact that I cycled my way to work. So, and there's something about that awareness, that sort of seeing how things really are, including the warts and all approach, and then still choosing to notice something good, feels like the kind of blend that is working for us at least, and it seems to fit with what you just said. So I love that. But actually asking how are you feeling as a sort of welcome question. As long as it's not just called across the street at someone you're passing by rapidly, where they sort of go and don't have time to respond.
Oh,
But
yes, you have to listen, by the way.
you've got to
Mark would want
listen.
you
You've
to
got to be
know,
there for the reply.
how are you feeling? Okay, great. Let's get to the agenda. That's not great. Like, how are you feeling? Oh, that's really interesting. Mark, tell me a little more about that is, a better way to do it.
Yeah, we're rapidly running out of time. I've loved this conversation. It's been so good. Roger's just asked an interesting question, which is not necessarily directly about character and happiness, but of course it really is actually. What can we really take away from this talk? Particularly, what can we do when we're stressed to calm ourselves? And of course, whether we're talking about the character we want to bring to the world or the happiness we love to feel, lots of us are feeling really stressed and actually struggle to find ways to sort of maintain our emotional balance. Any tips?
As I said, I think the revolution that's happening within our lives is that there is science on all these things that our grandparents did not have, and even maybe our own parents. Stress is a great example. We know so much more about what stress really is. What is the stress response? Why do all animals do, by the way, have a stress response? Like, why did Mother Nature give all animals a stress response, and why does it feel so bad? And what can I do about it, and what are the long-term outcomes? So let me just give you a little bit of the science of stress, just to give you an example of what I mean by this massive increase in psychological literacy. That doesn't necessarily make all your problems go away, but I think it's enormously helpful, and I wish our grandparents and even our parents had that the way that we do in our lives. So the stress response is the built-in response to when you perceive your threats or your challenges to, at the moment, be greater than your resources. So there's an asymmetry between what you're expected to do, what you need to do, what's happening, and what you feel like you can do in the moment. And then when you have elevated heart rate, and when your thoughts become very preoccupied about your problems, and when your hands get a little clammy, and when your adrenaline gets flowing, that is actually your body having the response of increasing its internal resources to meet the challenge. In other words, the stress response is actually an adaptive response, and that is why all animals have it. I mean, if zebras didn't have the stress response, there would be no zebras, right? Because it's, when you're being chased, you have to change. Now, the long-term effects of chronic and unrelenting stress are quite negative, and that is actually what science would say is the problem, not acute stress, but, for example, I mean, the pandemic now grinding into its second year, that is not great, because there is a kind of wear and tear on the system that is sometimes it's called allostatic load. The point is that there is a stress response. It's generally adaptive. Every human being has it. All animals have it, but there can be a tax or a cost to having unrelenting, stress responses in your life. And I think the idea of mindfulness and the idea of restorative self-care in whatever form it takes you, for some people that's going for their morning run. For other people, it's having a glass of wine with their best friend. For other people like me, I mean, I'll confess, it's like reading Us Weekly. I'm so embarrassed in a way, but I'm it also is incredibly awesome. So give me my Us Weekly at the end of the week, and I will look at celebrities and, just take my mind off things. So I think if you understand that the stress response is natural and fine, but you do need to find breaks from it, because you don't want a kind of chronic level of the stress response without any respite. And hopefully that's just, a little helpful. The next time you feel stressed and exhausted, you'll be like, oh yeah, right. Because Angela reminded me I'm human and this is normal. And this might be a good cue for me to, do a little something for myself to give myself some rest from it. And Mark, as I said, to me, just that literacy that we might have about our own emotions and about our stress response and everything else, everything you're doing at Action for Happiness, really, to me, is like, yeah, that's, making the revolution happen even faster.
Thank you, Angela. And I love how you brought that back to self-care as well. You may know, and I know many in the audience know, that we have these monthly themes, and we're in Self-Care September at the moment, having come out of Altruistic August. And so all around the world, people are using our action calendars, and on our Action for Happiness app, there's a huge community of people sort of supporting each other every day to do these little acts of self-care, which, as we remind ourselves, is not selfish. Self-care is kind of essential if we want to bring those character traits into the world. So I'm so grateful to you for giving your time and sharing all your wisdom with us today. Is there any final thought you'd like to leave us with before we part?
Well, I like to tell my own kids, hashtag work in progress. The inside joke is that, as my teenagers point out, like, rarely do adults actually use hashtags in the way that they're supposed to. But anyway, hashtag work in progress. Mark, I'm so far from a perfect person, but I am somebody who, like, I'm 51, and I hope there's never a day in my life that I've stopped learning, and trying, and growing. And I think that's one of the things I respect so much about your community. So thank you for your time, and for everyone making time for us today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. It's lovely to see, as always, all this great constructive feedback in the chat. Really lovely to be with you all around the world. And a special thanks again to you, Angela. Really grateful. Keep up the really inspiring work. Thank you.
Thank you.